His Majesty, Don Ferdinand, the King our Lord, King of Castile, Leon, and Asturias.
One of the interesting things about El Cid is that it is a big, bloated historical epic, which frankly is not a genre to which I'm favorably inclined as a rule. Portions of the film have a much more intimate quality, I think, than you would get with many other filmmakers. I think he seems less invested in the big set pieces and the battle sequences and the things involving scale than he does in many of the smaller moments. The first scene between El Cid and Jimena, he stages it almost as if they're opposing warriors in a battle. They very slowly sort of come together until they meet in the center of the screen, and that is the sort of attention to detail that I don't think that you often get from somebody like DeMille. It's less about the characters per se than their relationship to the other, either the architecture or other objects in the frame, which is also true, I think, in Mann's smaller films that are shot in a, squarer ratio, The Far Country and The Naked Spur and so forth. It's just he's adapting that style now to the demands of the big widescreen epic form, but trying to maintain a certain intimacy at the same time. And that's an interesting sort of struggle that he's engaged in there that I think gives the film an underlying tension. The moment where El Cid kills his fiance's father, which takes place around this huge circular staircase, which Mann uses to extraordinary effect, and he keeps doing these pivots around as people descend, and they kind of go underneath the staircase, and the moment of the actual slaying is not seen. And he chooses not to show you that moment at all, which is really an unusual choice for a big 60s Hollywood epic like this. That's usually something that they would really want to slam home. And Mann really makes the choice to just kind of shunt it off entirely and downplay it as much as possible. And similarly, the moment immediately after that where she discovers her father's body and you can barely see El Cid is like in the shadows still underneath the staircase. And there's no big confrontation between them, and we just sort of dissolve to the next scene, and now she hates him. Prompting the whole next, movement of the narrative. But the big confrontation that you would naturally expect to happen at that moment, we do not get at all. What would be, in an ordinary epic, big dramatic moments that I think he deliberately just throws away. And he seems to try to stage as many scenes in front of or near that staircase as possible just because of what it allows him to do with the camera. And the most extraordinary passage in the film, I think, is the wedding night sequence, which is almost completely dialogue-free. The moment when, they hate each other now after having been deeply in love because he killed her father. And then she goes up to her bedchamber and he remains down below, and Mann just cuts back and forth. And the Miklos Rocha score swells. And most of it's done with the music and just the editing, the shot selection. And in those moments where Heston's not actually saying anything, he actually does, I think, a very credible job of just, quietly allowing us to project our own emotions onto his face, and Sophia Loren as well. The two of them do fine in this sequence where they are essentially just vessels for Mann's filmmaking, and they just sort of do the absolute minimum and allow us and the film itself, the cinematic grammar, to fill in most of the gaps. I can't think of another film that has the dynamic between the love interests that this film does, where they start off in a sort of traditional way where they're, clinging to each other madly and they can't live without each other. And then one thing happens and suddenly they're like sworn enemies and she wants him dead. And then there's an extraordinary moment toward the end where they finally reconcile, which you've been waiting for the entire film, because obviously they're going to. And they get one scene of like connubial bliss where they presumably have sex, though that's not shown, and then they wake up the next morning and they're cuddling, and then they go to open the door, and suddenly there's this whole squadron of people out there demanding that he lead them into battle. And the expression on her face is priceless because her whole moment of bliss has just been completely wiped out in one fell swoop. And really, that's it. She, as far as we can tell, she barely sees him again after that.
Tomorrow, we will fight side by side. My king and I. We will ride out together. Together. No.
I think with a more expressive actor in this role, it could have been an even greater film than it is. I think Mann does an excellent job of making it work in spite of Heston's limitations. You know, because El Cid is being portrayed as essentially a living legend, it's not really, it doesn't demand great acting. It really demands mostly what Heston can provide, which is he looks awesome.
I want you and my children to remember me riding with my king.
The final scene of the film is the one that everybody really remembers, you know, with him as a corpse strapped onto the horse and, you know, leading allegedly his troops into battle. Obviously, it's a very potent image, which, by the way, they completely made up.
For God, the Cid, and Spain! The Cid and Spain!
He actually died 5 years after the battle that's being depicted there.
And thus the Cid rode out of the gates of history into legend.
But yeah, it's hard not to laugh at the image of Charlton Heston, who is largely considered to be one of the most wooden of the big Hollywood stars of that era. It's very symbolic to see him sort of, you know, just kind of placed out there and completely expressionless and emotionless, and yet commanding at the same time, which is basically his function as a movie star, is to do as little as possible except have that sort of noble profile and that chiseled jaw. And in that sense, and only that sense, he's the perfect actor for the role. You almost could argue that he needed to be in the rest of the movie in order to be in this final scene, because it's his presence in the final scene that makes it work, whereas a more expressive actor, that wouldn't have been as uniquely appropriate.
Right. It says something that the soldiers don't notice any difference between him living and him dead.
Yeah, nobody seems to notice.